It had rained the night before, a slow, grey drizzle that softened the streets of Paris and left a gentle dampness, clinging to the stone walls and iron railings. By morning, the rain had ceased, but the city still carried its scent: wet leaves, soot, and something faintly metallic. Chief Inspector Maigret sat by the window of his apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, cradling a bowl of coffee between his palms. His pipe, unlit, rested on the windowsill. Through the window, the chestnut trees in the square below dripped occasionally, not from rain now, but from memory. The sky was the color of pewter. Madame Maigret moved quietly behind him, folding linens. With care. There was no rush. It was Sunday, and Maigret, unassigned to any pressing case, had nothing to do but listen to the rustle of laundry, the creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of traffic. "I saw old Madame Quillen again," his wife said mildly, not looking up. "Still feeding pigeons with bits of brioche. She talks to them like children." Maigret made a sound, something between a chuckle and a sigh. "There's always someone like that," he murmured. "Every square has one." He reached for the pipe and tamped in the tobacco, but he didn't light it. Something about the weather, the wet bark of the trees, made the ritual feel unnecessary. He might have stayed like that all morning, sipping coffee, thinking of nothing in particular, had the telephone not rung. Its sharpness cut through the quiet like a spoon dropped in soup. He stood slowly, exhaling through his nose. The call, he assumed, would be routine. A report misfiled, a question from the Quai des Orfèvres. But when he lifted the receiver and heard Inspector Lognan's voice, breathless and clipped as ever, he knew better. "There's a man," Lognan began without preamble, "says he found something in a tree, a chestnut tree, in the Square du Temple. He walks his dog there, claims it's nothing at all. But he looked pale, didn't want to speak to a uniformed officer. Asked for you." Maigret frowned. What kind of something he didn't say? Just that it didn't look right. Odd, you know. Could be a prank, could be nothing, or it could be something, Maigret said. He rubbed his cheek. The bristles itched under his fingers. "I'll come." He hung up, still holding the receiver. For a moment before placing it back, Madame Maigret looked over, but said nothing. She knew the signs. How a certain tone in his voice meant the shift from husband to inspector, from warm apartment to cold cobblestones. He looked at her, then toward the window again. The trees still glistened in the morning light. "I'll be back before lunch," he said, though he already doubted it. She gave him a small smile and returned to folding the linens. Maigret walked to the Square du Temple. The air was cold but not biting, and the wind carried the scent of wet bark and distant roasting chestnuts. Children in wool coats chased pigeons. A woman in a red scarf smoked silently beside the bandstand. And near one of the old chestnut trees, bent, bark cracked like old leather, stood a man with a dachshund on a taut leash. His hat was in his hands, and he looked up only when Maigret approached. "You're Maigret?" the man asked. He was mid-40s, thin, with the type of face that seemed uncomfortable outdoors. "I am." The man nodded toward the tree. "It's just, I don't know how to say it. I walk here every morning. Jacques, my dog, he has his spot. I've passed this tree 100 times, but today he's swallowed. There's something wedged in the crook, just above eye level. I thought it was paper, but when I looked closer, he shook his head, unable to finish. Maigret stepped closer. The chestnut tree was old, its branches warped and knotted. Rain still clung to its bark. In a narrow fork of the trunk, something pale jutted from behind the bark. The corner of a handkerchief, perhaps. No, it was cloth, but darker. Maigret reached in slowly and drew it out. A child's scarf, faded red, worn thin. He turned it over, and something small and heavy dropped into his palm, a silver brooch shaped like a swan. Its pin-broken dot, the man shivered. I told you it wasn't normal. Maigret didn't answer. He looked down at the object in his hand, then up at the tree, then across the square. Watching people move through the morning without knowing anything had changed. And yet, something had Maigret turned the brooch over in his hand. The edges, smooth but worn, the metal darkened by time. The swan, delicate and poised, seemed almost absurd against the backdrop of the grey Paris morning. It was the kind of thing someone might lose carelessly, but its presence here, wedged into the tree like an afterthought, suggested something else. The man with the dachshund, still trembling slightly, looked away, his eyes darting to the ground. I don't know why I noticed it, but I did. His voice, strained now, hinted at something deeper. It didn't belong. Not here. Maigret tucked the brooch into his coat pocket and glanced at the tree once more. The leaves above them shivered in the cold wind, their edges curling like forgotten papers. He could feel the weight of the brooch, its quiet insistence. In the pit of his stomach, "You're sure you didn't see anyone here earlier? Anyone who might have left it?" Maigret's voice was calm, measured, not pressing. He wasn't sure yet what it meant, but he needed to hear the answer. The man shook his head, still looking away. "I come every morning, and today, this was the only thing out of place. The rest of it, it's always the same, just dogs, pigeons, and the occasional jogger. It's routine." "Routine," Maigret repeated, but his thoughts drifted to the scarf, faded, worn by hands long ago, and the brooch. Something told him it hadn't been lost by accident. He let the man's silence fill the space between them. People who said too much often revealed more than they intended. But this one wasn't talking. That, in itself, told Maigret something. "Your name?" Maigret asked gently. "Romain. Pierre." "Romain," the man answered, eyes still on the ground. "I'm a teacher. I live in the 15th. Just passing through on my usual walk." A teacher. The word didn't sit right with Maigret. Something in the man's posture, the way he fidgeted, suggested a mind more restless than the occupation suggested. Yet, there was nothing in his expression that betrayed guilt, just discomfort. Was it fear of something he'd seen, or fear of something he'd missed? "Do you live alone, Monsieur Romain?" He nodded. "Yes, of course, alone." "Thank you for your help." Maigret didn't want to dismiss him too quickly, but the man seemed to be retreating into himself. I'll need to. Speak to the officer who saw you earlier. Perhaps there's more to this than you realize. Romain nodded again, backing away without a word. The dog, having sensed the change in his master's mood, tugged at its leash. Eager to continue the walk. Maigret watched them leave. The dog's paws clicking on the wet pavement, then turned his attention back to the tree. He lingered for a moment longer, noticing how ordinary everything seemed around him. The same old chestnut trees, the same damp air, the same distant hum of the city. And yet, something was off. The brooch, the scarf, the silence from the man. They clung to the scene, like echoes of something unsaid. Maigret felt it, deep within. But it wasn't yet time to act. Not yet. Back at the station, Maigret sat at his desk, the brooch now resting before him. He studied it in the quiet of his office, absent-mindedly tapping the end of his pipe against the surface of the desk. His eyes narrowed, and his mind wandered, tracing the curve of the swan. The delicate feathers, the craftsmanship. It wasn't an antique, nor was it particularly expensive. It was a trinket, something personal, perhaps even sentimental. But whose? The office was muted. Outside, the rain had started again, tapping softly against the windows. Inside, the murmurs of other detectives carried faintly. No one was interested in the brooch. Not yet, but Maigret's instinct told him it meant more. Then it seemed. It was only after the usual rounds of paperwork that the call came through. It was from Inspector Lognon, his voice a little more urgent than before. Maigret, I found something. The scarf, the one you took from the tree. It belonged to a woman. Her name's Marie-Laure Bouvier. She's been missing for nearly 2 weeks. Now, the words hit Maigret with a quiet force. Missing for 2 weeks. The scarf had been a marker, a clue left behind. But why here? In a tree in a park. I'll be there, Maigret said, his voice steady. But something had shifted. A missing person, a woman, no less, now tied to an object found in a public park. This was no longer a simple case. He left his desk without another word. His coat already on, another layer of the story was beginning to unravel. But there was still much hidden beneath the surface. The rain had intensified as Maigret made his way to the Bouvier residence, a modest apartment on Rue de la Roquette. He could feel the weight of the case settling on him now, not from evidence, but from the emotional undercurrent that tugged at the edges of each moment. He had to listen closely to the pauses, the hesitations, the ways people avoided looking at you when they had something to hide. The apartment building was old, the hallways dimly lit, and the smell of damp wood hung in the air. When he knocked on the door, it opened almost immediately, as if the woman's family had been expecting him. The person who answered was a man in his early 50s, his face tired but attentive. He offered Maigret a small, nervous smile. "You must be Maigret," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm Robert Bouvier, Marie-Laure's brother." He stepped aside, allowing Maigret to enter. "I'm afraid we've been waiting for news. We don't know where she is." "No one does." Robert's voice faltered, his eyes briefly betraying a deep, underlying sorrow. Maigret said nothing at first, letting the silence settle between them. And then, As if the weight of the silence were too much to bear, Robert continued. She had a few things going on, personal troubles, nothing too unusual. But we never expected. He trailed off, unable to finish this sentence. Maigret nodded slowly, his gaze steady, his presence calm. He didn't need to push, not yet. The truth, it seemed, was already beginning to emerge from the shadows. The apartment felt smaller once Maigret was inside, crowded with the weight of what wasn't being said. Robert Bouvier led him into a dimly lit sitting room, its furniture well-worn but carefully arranged, as though each object had been chosen not for style, but for its quiet permanence. The heavy curtains were drawn against the rain. The light inside filtered through the pale glow of a lamp. The air smelled faintly of coffee and something else. Something Maigret couldn't quite place, a scent that, in its unfamiliarity, made him uneasy. "Please, sit." Robert gestured towards a chair by the window, his hands trembling slightly. "I'll make us some coffee. I imagine you'll have questions." Maigret nodded, taking a seat, his eyes scanning the room. There was a large painting on the wall, an abstract piece that seemed out of place in a home that otherwise held little in the way of flair. It was as if Marie-Laure had deliberately distanced herself from everything familiar. As Robert moved to the small kitchen area, Maigret's gaze shifted to the photographs scattered across the mantelpiece. Most were black and white, showing a younger Robert and Marie-Laure in what appeared to be family gatherings. But one in particular caught his attention, a photograph of a man and a woman, both in their early 30s, standing side by side, in front of what looked like a countryside home. The woman was smiling, but the man's expression was unreadable. A slight distance between them that Maigret noticed only because it was so subtle. "What's this?" Maigret asked, his voice quiet but intentional. Robert froze for a moment, then glanced back over his shoulder. "Oh, it's from years ago, before Marie-Laure met Francois. Her husband, Francois," Maigret repeated, as if testing the name. The man who had disappeared from the picture, leaving only his wife behind. Robert hesitated before setting down the coffee cups and joining Maigret at the window. "Yes, Francois. They were married for a while, about 5 years, but the marriage was difficult. I wouldn't say it ended well, but she loved him, still does, I think." Maigret took in the man's posture, his stiff shoulders, and the way his words slowed as he spoke. There was something that didn't sit right. The way Robert said loved as if he hadn't quite come to terms with the past himself. "I see," Maigret said slowly. "And Francois, what happened to him?" "Disappeared, just vanished. 6 months ago. He left for a business trip to Lyon. He never returned. We never heard from him after that." The answer hung in the air like a cloud, heavy with unspoken truths. Maigret leaned back slightly, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. "So, no word, no contact at all?" "No," Robert replied. "The authorities are looking into it, but no one knows anything." Maigret's fingers drummed once, twice on the armrest of the chair. "A man who simply vanished. In most cases, people left behind clues, letters, calls, or some trace. of their intentions. But Francois, nothing. It wasn't quite normal. And now, a woman missing for 2 weeks, and the connection to a brooch in a park. The pieces were beginning to form a shape, but Maigret wasn't ready to name it yet. What kind of man was Francois? Maigret asked. Robert's gaze turned distant. He paused. He was distant. I don't know if I ever really understood him. He was a businessman, always busy. But Marie-Laure, she adored him. She was so focused on him, even after everything. How did they meet? Maigret pressed, his voice neutral. Robert's eyes flickered to the photograph. Again, the one of the smiling couple. Through work. They met when Marie-Laure was working for a publishing house. He was a client, some wealthy businessman. She was young. I think she saw him as more than he was. She thought he could offer her everything. And did he? Maigret asked, studying Robert's face. The answer would be in his eyes. Robert's lips tightened. No, not exactly. But for a while, it looked like he would. He gave her gifts, told her she was beautiful, and made her feel important. But then he stopped. Things changed. He became distant, and so did she. Still, she tried. For a long time. But eventually, she gave up on him, or he gave up on her. Maigret leaned forward slightly, placing the brooch on the table between them. This belonged to your sister, didn't it? Robert blinked, clearly startled by the sudden shift in the conversation. Yes, he said, after a pause. I'm sure of it. It was hers. She wore it often. Where was it found? A park. Near the tree. The chestnut tree. Why? Robert's voice held a note of confusion, and Maigret felt his instincts sharpen. Do you think your sister would leave it there? Maigret asked, his tone soft, but probing. Robert's mouth opened and then closed again. He looked away. I don't know. I can't say. Marie-Laure was complicated. She did things sometimes without explaining them. She could disappear for hours, even days, and no one would know. It was as if she needed to escape everything. Maigret took a slow breath, considering the man's words. Escape. That wasn't something you did lightly. It wasn't a decision made in a vacuum. It was a reaction to something deeper, something that you ran from. Maigret wasn't sure yet what Marie-Laure was running from, but it was clear she hadn't been entirely free of whatever it was. That haunted her. I think she's still alive, Maigret said softly, studying Robert's face closely. But she's hiding from someone or something. The man shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the edge of the chair. Do you really think so? He sounded unsure, a hint of hope flickering in his voice. I do, Maigret replied, his voice as calm as ever. But she won't be found unless we understand why she left in the first place. Robert nodded, then fell silent, his gaze cast downward. Maigret knew there was more to the story. There always was, but he wouldn't press it just yet. People revealed their truths when they were ready. The silence stretched between them for a long moment, only broken by the rhythmic tapping of the rain against the window. Maigret rose, taking a final look at the photographs on the mantelpiece, and then glanced back at Robert. I'll need to see her room. Is it still as it was when she left? Robert nodded. Yes, it's untouched. Maigret didn't say anything more. He simply turned toward the narrow hallway, his mind already working through the possibilities. The pieces of the puzzle were still scattered, but he was beginning to see a shape. Faint and fragmented, the hallway was dim, the air cool and still, broken only by the faint sound of Robert's footsteps trailing behind him. Maigret's own were slow, deliberate, his body moving with the kind of calm purpose that often accompanied his investigations. He could sense the weight of things in the silence of the house, the absence of a woman who had once filled it. With her presence, the lingering scent of coffee now grown stale. But beyond the echoes of Marie-Laure's absence, something else hung in the air, a tension, a quiet disquiet that only deepened as Maigret reached the door at the end of the hallway. It was closed, but not locked, a sign that perhaps Robert had made no effort to change anything in his sister's room. The door creaked slightly as Maigret pushed it open, revealing a space that felt like a snapshot of a life frozen in time. The room was small but tidy, with only a few personal touches. A vase of dried flowers on a shelf, a book on the nightstand, and a pair of shoes neatly lined up by the bed. It was a woman's room, simple yet intimate, as though someone had been trying to create a semblance of order. In the midst of an increasingly chaotic life, Maigret stepped inside, his gaze sweeping across the room. He didn't need to see much. The details would reveal themselves as they always did. The bed was unmade, as if someone had left in a hurry. The curtains, once drawn back, now hung limply by the window. The whole room seemed to be holding its breath. He moved to the nightstand first, his hand resting briefly on the surface. There were a few things here: a half-empty glass of water, a box of tissues, and a stack of books that had been read many times over. But it was something else that caught Maigret's eye. A small envelope tucked underneath the stack. He paused, fingers grazing over it, then carefully pulled it out. There was no name or address, only the faint imprint of something, written in pen, now nearly faded. Maigret didn't open the envelope. Not yet. He placed it gently back down and moved on to the closet. Inside, there were clothes, some worn, others still with their tags on. It was strange, the mixture of the practical and the untouched. Marie-Laure had been preparing for something. But what? The wardrobe felt like it was half-finished, like someone had been caught between decisions, unsure of what to leave behind and what to take. His eyes drifted back to the room, scanning the walls and corners for anything that felt out of place. It was subtle, the kind of dissonance that was hard to pin down, but it was there. And then his gaze landed on the chestnut tree outside the window. Through the rain, its leaves were darkened, almost black, and its branches seemed to reach for something beyond the glass, as if the tree itself was trying to speak. Maigret stood still for a moment, staring at the tree, and in that stillness, it came to him, the secret, not in the room, but in the space between it and the world outside. The tree, a silent sentinel, had witnessed something, something that tied Marie-Laure to this place. The connection was faint but undeniable. "Inspector, is there anything else?" Robert's voice broke the silence, and Maigret turned to find the man standing at the door, his face weary, his eyes darting nervously. "I'm still looking," Maigret said quietly, though he didn't need to say more. Robert, it seemed, wasn't prepared to delve into his sister's life, and Maigret was certain that there was something more the man was not saying. But for now, he wouldn't push, not yet. He moved to the window, his fingers tracing the cool glass. "Does Marie-Laure often go out to the park?" he asked, as if the question had come to him only by chance. "Not often," Robert replied, quickly, his tone betraying a touch of defensiveness. "She used to walk there, sometimes. But not for years, not since Francois disappeared." Maigret nodded, as though he hadn't expected any different. The park, the chestnut tree, it was becoming more and more significant in his mind. But what had happened there? What was the connection between the brooch, the missing woman, and this old tree? He let the question hang in the air, turning away from the window and back to the envelope on the nightstand. Slowly, he reached for it, his fingers curling around the paper as he pulled it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink smudged in places, the handwriting uneven. It read, "Meet me at the chestnut tree, midnight. I need to tell you everything. Don't tell anyone. I'm scared." It was short, but it was enough. Maigret's gaze lingered on the words, then on the tree outside, midnight. The timing struck him as significant. But what had Marie-Laure feared? And why had she chosen to meet someone in such a public place? One that was so deeply tied to her past? Maigret folded the note carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, his mind already working through the possibilities. Whoever Marie-Laure had been meeting had been important enough to risk everything for. But why was she scared? Who had she been running from? "Robert," Maigret said, turning back to the man, who was standing in the doorway, his hands wringing together nervously. "Do you know of anyone who might have caused her to be afraid? Someone who might have been threatening her?" Robert shook his head, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. I don't know." She kept to herself, mostly, but sometimes I would see her in the park, talking to someone. A man. But I never knew who it was. "Did she ever mention him to you?" Maigret pressed. "No," Robert replied, his voice tight. "She was always private about those things. But she seemed different after she started meeting him. More withdrawn, more distant." Maigret took a moment to consider Robert's words, then turned toward the door. "I'm going to speak to the neighbors," he said quietly. "See if anyone saw anything unusual. I'll need a list of everyone she's spoken to recently." Robert nodded, but Maigret could see the unease creeping into his expression. The man wasn't sure if he was being helpful, or if he was inadvertently helping to dig up more than he was prepared for. Still, Robert had given him enough, a connection, however fragile, to someone else in Marie-Laure's life. It was a lead, and Maigret would follow it, just as he followed all things, slowly, methodically, piece by piece. As Maigret made his way out of the room, he cast one last look at the chestnut tree, its silhouette against the rain-drenched sky. The tree, silent and unmoving, seemed to hold secrets, And if Margaret knew one thing, it was that all things, no matter how hidden, would eventually reveal themselves. The rain had not let up. Margaret stepped out into the soft, persistent downpour, feeling the dampness seep through his coat. It wasn't a particularly cold rain, but it was the kind that soaked into everything, giving the city a sense of heaviness that seemed to cling to the soul. He stood for a moment in the doorway of the house, letting the world around him fall into place, the puddles reflecting the dim, flickering lights of the street lamps, the faint murmur of distant voices from the cafes, the occasional gust of wind rattling the branches of the chestnut tree. The air smelled of wet earth, of something old and forgotten. He had to start somewhere, and the neighbors seemed as good a place as any. The old woman across the street, Mrs. Dubois, was often seen tending to her plants, and Margaret knew that her eyes were as sharp as any detective's. She knew the rhythms of the street better than anyone. If anyone had seen something unusual in the days before Marie-Laur's disappearance, it would be her. The street was quiet, save for the occasional car passing in the distance. Margaret's shoes splashed softly as he walked down the sidewalk, his mind replaying the words of the note he had found in Marie-Laur's room. "I need to tell you everything. Don't tell anyone. I'm scared." He had seen fear before, but this felt different. This wasn't the kind of fear that could be chased away by a reassuring word or a comforting gesture. No, this was the kind of fear that drove people to do things they wouldn't normally do, like meeting in the dead of night under the cover of a tree. The sound of his steps echoed in the narrow, empty street, broken only by the occasional creak of a shutter or the distant murmur of a television. He stopped in front of Mrs. Dubois' small, ivy-covered house and rang the bell. The sharp sound of the bell was followed by the soft shuffle of feet, and soon the door creaked open. "Ah, Inspector Margaret," Mrs. Dubois said, her face wrinkled with age but sharp with curiosity. "What brings you here on such a dreary evening? Surely you're not after more of that young woman's affairs?" Margaret smiled slightly, though it was more out of politeness than humor. "I'm afraid I am. I was hoping you could help me, Mrs." Dubois raised an eyebrow but stepped aside, allowing him to enter. "Come in, come in. It's no surprise you'd be here. The whole street is buzzing about it. You know how people talk." Margaret nodded, taking a seat at the small wooden table in the corner of the room. The dim light from the lamp cast shadows on the walls, and the smell of stew lingered in the air. Mrs. Dubois busied herself in the kitchen, her movements slow but sure, as though the routine of her life had never wavered. "Did you know Marie-Laure well?" Margaret asked, his voice steady but low. Mrs. Dubois paused, her back turned to him as she stirred something in the pot. "Not well, no." She kept to herself mostly, always polite, always cordial, but distant, and when she wasn't at home, she was out, somewhere, with someone. "Who?" Margaret pressed, his gaze sharp despite his calm demeanor. Mrs. Dubois looked over her shoulder, her face tight with uncertainty. "I don't know for sure." She never mentioned any names, but there were times when I'd see her walking in the park with a man, always the same man. He had dark hair, tall, broad-shouldered. He never looked at me, always kept his eyes straight ahead. Maigret absorbed this quietly, his mind already running through the possibilities. A man in the park, a secret meeting. It fit with the note. But why hadn't anyone seen this man before? Why the secrecy? Do you know where this man lived? Maigret asked. Mrs. Dubois shook her head. No, I never got that impression. He wasn't one to engage with anyone, not even with the usual folk in the park. I don't think anyone really spoke to him. He came and went like a shadow. A shadow. That's how it always began. The hints of something darker, something hidden. Maigret felt his pulse quicken ever so slightly. But he didn't show it. He let his calm mask settle back into place. Do you know if Marple or ever mentioned him to anyone, her brother, a friend? Mrs. Dubois shook her head again, but this time there was a slight hesitance in her movement. Maigret's eyes narrowed. Though he said nothing, he could tell when someone was lying by omission. And Mrs. Dubois had said just enough to make him curious. He decided to press a little further. Have you noticed anything else unusual? Anything that seemed out of place in the days before she disappeared? The woman stopped stirring for a moment, her eyes dropping to the floor. Now that you mention it, there was something odd. I saw her leave one evening with that man. Just the two of them. But they didn't go to the park. They walked in the opposite direction, toward the old chestnut tree. Maigret's breath hitched ever so slightly. The chestnut tree, of course. The place mentioned in the note. It was no coincidence. What time was this? Maigret asked, trying to keep his voice even. Late. Maybe around 10 o'clock, Mrs. Dubois replied. But it was dark, and I wasn't sure where they were going. I saw them disappear into the fog, and then I went back to my business. Maigret nodded slowly, processing the new information. The chestnut tree, the mysterious man, the note. There was a thread here, a connection. But it was still thin, fragile, and barely perceptible. He would need more, a more complete picture. Thank you, Mrs. Dubois, he said, standing up. You've been most helpful. She nodded, her face still holding a trace of concern. I hope you find her, Inspector. It's a strange business, this. People don't just disappear. No, they don't, Maigret replied, his voice quiet but resolute. As he left her house and stepped back into the rain-soaked street, Maigret felt a quiet certainty settling in. This was no ordinary case. It wasn't just about a missing woman or a shadowy man. No, it was something deeper. Something tied to the past, to the old chestnut tree, and to a secret that had been waiting to be uncovered. But what was it? And who was the man in the park? Maigret didn't have the answers yet, but he knew he was getting closer, and that was enough for now. The fog had thickened as Maigret made his way to the park the following evening. The air was damp and heavy with a kind of quiet that only fog could bring. It muffled sounds, turned the world into a muted watercolor of silhouettes, and made everything feel a little more distant, more isolated. The street lamps cast weak, yellow pools of light, their glow barely making a dent in the haze. Maigret had always found the fog comforting. In his line of work, It was the kind of silence that allowed people to reveal things they didn't even know. They were hiding Dot as he approached the park. He could barely make out the old chestnut tree in the distance, its gnarled branches swaying slightly in the breeze. It stood as a sentinel, a quiet witness to whatever had transpired under its boughs. Maigret slowed his pace as he entered the park, his eyes scanning the area. He could almost see the silhouette of Marie-Laure walking away with that tall, broad-shouldered man heading toward the tree. He could almost hear the soft crunch of their footsteps on the damp leaves. But that was in the past. What mattered now was the present. He had to find out who that man was. The park was eerily empty, save for a few figures hunched beneath the trees, trying to escape the worst of the rain. There was a bench nearby, and Maigret sat down, pulling his collar up against the cold. He had no intention of rushing. He had learned long ago that the best way to get answers was not by pushing, but by waiting, allowing time to unravel the truth in its own way. The minutes stretched on, but Maigret didn't mind. His patience was his greatest asset. He watched the park slowly transform as the light dimmed and the shadows lengthened. Slowly, people began to leave, one by one, their hurried footsteps disappearing into the fog. And yet, Maigret remained, his thoughts drifting back to Mrs. Dubois' description of the man. Tall, broad-shouldered, always kept his eyes straight ahead, never looked at anyone. There was something about that description that felt wrong, almost forced. It didn't fit. People, especially those who wanted to hide, always had a way of giving themselves away with little details. This man, however, had made sure to remain a mystery. But Maigret knew that mysteries like that didn't stay hidden forever. Just as Maigret was beginning to wonder whether he would see anyone at all, a figure emerged from the fog, moving toward the tree. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and, yes, he did seem to keep his eyes fixed ahead, not looking at the few other souls who passed him on the path. His coat was dark, and his posture suggested someone who didn't want to be noticed, but was used to being in charge. Maigret leaned forward, his heart beating just a fraction faster. He remained motionless, studying the man from behind the veil of fog. The man stopped beneath the chestnut tree, his gaze traveling up the trunk as if looking for something in its knotted bark. His hands were stuffed deep into his coat pockets. For a long moment, he stood there, unmoving, as though waiting for something or someone. Then, without warning, he turned and walked toward the edge of the park. Maigret hesitated for only a moment before standing up, following the man from a distance. His footsteps were quiet, absorbed by the fog, and the path seemed to swallow the sound of his movements. It was almost as though he wasn't walking at all, just drifting along the edges of the park, just as the fog itself seemed to drift. The man didn't glance back, but Maigret knew he was being watched in his own way. There was a tension in the way the man carried himself, a kind of unease that Maigret recognized immediately. It wasn't a typical criminal nervousness, but rather something more subtle, the anxiety of someone who had been hiding something for far too long. As they reached the park's exit, Maigret took a step to the side, moving closer to the man, but not directly confronting him. He needed to hear more. to feel the weight of his words before he made his move. The man stopped at the corner of the street, glancing over his shoulder once more. For a moment, he hesitated, his breath visible in the cold air, before he crossed the street and disappeared into the fog. Maigret stood still for a moment, considering what he had just seen. It was a curious thing, nothing overtly suspicious. Yet Maigret had the distinct impression that something more was going on beneath the surface. The man hadn't acted like someone caught in the act, but there was an unmistakable sense of guilt. In the way he moved, Maigret followed at a distance, keeping the man in his sights. He made his way down several more streets, each one more deserted than the last, until they arrived at a small, dimly lit building on a quiet side street. The man disappeared through the door without a second glance, and Maigret remained where he was, watching, waiting. This was the place. This was where he would find his answers. He approached the building cautiously, his thoughts turning over everything he had learned so far. He didn't believe in coincidences, especially not in his line of work. The note, the chestnut tree, the man, everything pointed in the same direction. But what was the connection? What was the truth buried underneath the layers of silence? The front door of the building was closed, but Maigret noticed a small, unmarked window to the side. He moved closer, squatting down to peer inside. Through the dim light, he could make out a few figures too, perhaps 3 sitting at a small table, talking in low voices. Their silhouettes were blurry, but one of them stood out, the broad-shouldered man, still wearing his dark coat. Maigret's pulse quickened, but he stayed still, watching. There was no sign of Marie-Laure, no sign of anyone else from the case. But the fact that this man was meeting with someone else was a crucial detail. Whoever he was involved in something more complicated than Maigret had initially assumed. The conversation inside the building continued, muffled and indistinct. But Maigret couldn't tear himself away. He needed to hear more. He needed to know what was being said. His patience, as always, would be the key. The night had settled in fully now, and the park had fallen quiet. The only sound was the occasional rattle of distant cars on the wet pavement. Maigret remained, crouched near the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he watched the shadows move inside the building. He had long since learned to disregard the cold and the wet, focusing only on the ebb and flow of human behavior, the subtle shifts in body language, the tiny gestures that spoke louder than words. Inside the dimly lit room, the conversation continued in low, murmured tones. Maigret could only make out fragments. But he wasn't looking for specifics just yet. He was waiting for a pattern to emerge, a rhythm in the way they spoke, the way they moved. The broad-shouldered man stood still, hands clasped behind his back, his face mostly obscured by the shadows. Maigret's instincts told him that this man had something to hide, perhaps more than he even realized. He'd been too careful so far, too controlled. People like that, Maigret knew, were often the ones with the most to lose. The door to the room creaked open, and another figure entered, tall, thin, and wearing a long coat that was too light for the chill of the night. This newcomer was more agitated than the others. He spoke quickly, almost as if he was trying to make up for lost time. Maigret couldn't hear his exact words, but the tone of his voice was urgent, pleading. Maigret's thoughts wandered back to Marie-Laure. The connection was there. He could feel it. The chestnut tree, the man. The secret she had been keeping, all of it was tangled up in this moment. She had been involved in something, maybe unknowingly, but it was clear that she wasn't just an innocent bystander. The conversation inside the building grew more animated, the voices rising in pitch, though still muffled by the thick walls. Maigret's eyes narrowed as he tried to piece together what was happening. He could see the broad-shouldered man's body language stiffen, his hands moving from behind his back to his pockets, a sure sign that something had changed. He was no longer in control. Maigret took a step back, moving silently to the side of the building. He would need to find another way inside if he wanted to hear more. He could sense that he was getting closer to something important, but he couldn't afford to make a mistake. The slightest misstep could cause everything to unravel. The back of the building was just as dark as the front, but Maigret's eyes adjusted quickly to the gloom. He moved along the alley, the dampness of the stone walls seeping into his coat. As he passed, there was a small window, slightly ajar, and Maigret paused to listen. The voices inside were clearer now, though still indistinct. He leaned closer, straining to make out the words. He could hear the thin man's voice rising again, desperate, pleading. "You don't understand. We have to do it tonight. He'll be here tomorrow, and then it'll be too late. You don't know what he's capable of." The broad-shouldered man responded with calm authority, his voice low but firm. "It's already too late. We've made our choices. There's nothing more to do." Maigret's heart began to beat faster. Choices? What choices were they talking about? Who was this he that they were so afraid of? The conversation shifted again, this time to something more private. The voices lowered, the urgency in the air turning to something quieter, more measured. Maigret strained to hear, but he couldn't make out the words. He took a step back, deciding that it was time to move on. He had heard enough. He couldn't stay here indefinitely, and it was clear that whatever was being said inside the room was critical. But it was also clear that the answers weren't going to come easy. They would be buried under layers of silence, just like everything else. Maigret turned and made his way back to the street, his thoughts still tangled in the conversation he had just overheard. The man in the park, the chestnut tree, Marie-Laure. As it was leading him down a path he hadn't yet fully understood. But he was close. He could feel it dot as he reached the corner. A faint sound broke through the fog, a soft rustling, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Maigret turned, his instincts immediately on alert. A figure emerged from the mist, walking at a brisk pace. It was the broad-shouldered man. Maigret didn't move, standing still in the shadows as the man approached. He had no intention of confronting him directly, at least not yet. He simply needed to observe, to see if the man would give anything away with his actions. The man passed by Maigret without a glance, his footsteps measured, his body stiff with tension. He didn't appear to be in a hurry, but there was a sense of purpose in his stride. Maigret remained in the shadows, following at a distance as the man made his way down the street. For a moment, Maigret considered going directly after him, but he quickly dismissed the thought. Now was not the time to act. He needed to let the man lead him where he wanted to go. It was the only way to understand what was really happening here. The fog wrapped itself around Maigret like a second skin, and he followed the man through the empty streets, his mind working through the pieces of the puzzle. The more he thought about the conversation inside the building, the more he felt that something was off. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a sense that the clock was ticking down, and whatever had been set in motion couldn't be stopped. The man led him to an old, worn apartment building on a side street, and Maigret watched as he disappeared inside. He lingered for a moment longer, considering his next move. But there was no time for hesitation. Something was happening, and Maigret knew he had to be there when it all came to a head. The apartment building was just as Maigret had imagined it, dark, crumbling, with a cold, oppressive air about it. The faint smell of dampness clung to the walls as he made his way up the narrow, creaking staircase. The building was not unlike many others Maigret had seen over the years. It was a place for people who had faded from society's spotlight, their lives not so much forgotten as simply ignored. He couldn't help but wonder who else lived here. What other secrets the walls might be hiding? He paused on the landing, listening. There was no sound, not a word, not a breath. The man had disappeared into one of the apartments number 12. He noted. It was a good sign. No one was in a rush, and that was always a clue that something was wrong. If they were rushing, Maigret knew they were trying to hide something. But this man, this broad-shouldered figure, had moved deliberately, almost like a man at peace with what he had done or was about to do. Maigret's instincts had sharpened in the last few days. The more he observed, the more questions he had. Who was this man, really? And why had he been so quick to leave the park, as if he knew Maigret was watching? There was something unnerving in that something that didn't sit right with him. Maigret pulled his coat tighter round himself, then moved toward the door of apartment 12. He hadn't decided yet if he would knock. It wasn't his style. Instead, he would wait. Remain patient. The door, old and worn like everything else in the building, was cracked slightly open. He didn't need to force his way in. He would just listen and observe. From inside came a low murmur. Voices mixed in with the occasional sound of movement. A chair scraping against the floor. Maigret waited, his back against the peeling wallpaper, his breath steady. After a few minutes, he stepped forward and peered through the crack dot inside. The broad-shouldered man was sitting at a small table, talking with the thin man from earlier. Both looked tense, their movements stilted, as if trying to maintain control over something they couldn't fully grasp. Maigret could see their faces more clearly now. The thin man's sharp features and nervous eyes, the broad-shouldered man's implacable calm. The thin man leaned forward, his hands trembling as they rested on the table. His voice was low but urgent. "I told you. It's no use. We've already done everything we can. The money's gone, and it's over. There's nothing else left to do." The broad-shouldered man remained silent. his eyes fixed on the thin man with an intensity that made Maigret uneasy. It wasn't that the man was threatening, far from it. It was the weight of his silence that was unsettling. Maigret had learned over the years that silence could be more dangerous than words. And in this moment, that silence was heavy with something Maigret couldn't quite name. Finally, the broad-shouldered man spoke, his voice deep and controlled. "You're wrong," he said, each word deliberate, as if measuring its impact. "It's never over. Not until we're sure. You don't understand what we're dealing with here. If we don't act, everything we've done will be for nothing." The thin man seemed to shrink under the weight of those words, his face pale and drawn. Maigret could sense the unease in the room, but he couldn't yet put his finger on what it was that was making both men so tense. "I don't care what happens," the thin man muttered, though there was a tremor in his voice. "Just don't bring me into this anymore. I've done enough. The rest is up to you." A long silence followed. The broad-shouldered man stood and walked to the window, his back to the room. He stared out into the misty night, his silhouette outlined against the dim glow of the street lamp below. The thin man remained seated, his eyes fixed on his hands, as if he were trying to find something in them to focus on. The quiet stretched on, thick and suffocating. Maigret shifted slightly, his feet aching from the awkward position, but he didn't move from his place. His mind was racing. He had been listening carefully, and while nothing had been said outright, a pattern was beginning to form in his mind. The money, the urgency, the fear in the thin man's eyes, these were the clues. But they were only fragments. The rest, the truth behind it all, remained just out of reach. After a long moment, the broad-shouldered man turned around and looked back at his companion. "We'll do it tomorrow," he said, his voice cool and final. "I'll make sure everything is ready." The thin man nodded, though Maigret could see the reluctance in his posture. He didn't want to be part of whatever was coming. But it was clear that he didn't have a choice. Maigret couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the cusp of discovering something crucial, but every step he took only led to more questions. The broad-shouldered man reached for his coat, and the thin man stood, ready to leave. They exchanged a few more words, but Maigret couldn't make them out. Then the door opened, and the two men walked out, leaving Maigret standing there in the dark hallway, alone with his thoughts. He waited for a few moments, listening to their footsteps recede into the distance. When he was sure they were gone, he made his move. He didn't enter the apartment immediately. Instead, he took a moment to consider his next steps. Something told him that the truth wasn't hidden in the words they had exchanged, but rather in the silence they left behind. The apartment was sparse, barely any furniture beyond the necessities. A small kitchen in the corner, a table in the center of the room, and a few chairs scattered around. The windows were covered with old, thick curtains, their edges frayed with age. It was a place that spoke of a life lived in isolation, of someone who had little to hide but still managed to keep to themselves. Maigret stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room for anything out of place. Nothing stood out at first. But then he noticed the small chest in the corner. It was a plain thing, unremarkable, But there was something about it that caught his attention. It was too well hidden for something so insignificant. The chestnut tree outside. The conversations he'd overheard. The looks exchanged between the men, it all led him back here. Maigret knelt by the chest and, with a steady hand, began to open it. Maigret's fingers brushed the worn wood of the chest, his mind turning over the fragments of the puzzle like a key searching for its lock. The chest was old, certainly, and its craftsmanship spoke of a time when people valued simple, sturdy things. He hesitated, then carefully lifted the lid. The scent of dust and age greeted him, mingled with the faint, sour odor of something long neglected. Inside the chest, there was little. A few old clothes, an assortment of papers, a bundle of letters tied with string. But it was the small, unmarked box at the bottom of the chest that drew his attention. It was the sort of box that would be easy to overlook, plain, nondescript, no adornment to give it weight or value. Yet Maigret knew, from his years of experience, that the most insignificant things often hid the most significant truths. He carefully moved the other items aside and reached for the box. It was small, not even large enough to hold a decent amount of money, but the weight of it felt wrong, as though something inside was out of place. Maigret lifted the box from the chest, cradling it in his palm as if it might crack under the pressure of a mere touch. He turned it over. The bottom was unmarked, no clues to its contents. There was only a faint, almost imperceptible indentation around the edges, as though it had been opened before and was now carefully reclosed. A slow breath. He opened the box. Inside, tucked away beneath a piece of old cloth, was a key, simple in design, brass, aged with time, but unmistakably a key one that was far too small to open a chest like the one before him. There was no explanation for it, no direct connection between this small key and the circumstances surrounding the men Maigret had overheard earlier, but the key had its own presence. It was meant to be found, placed precisely where Maigret had discovered it. There was no mistake. He closed the box gently and returned it to the chest, keeping the key in his hand. It was a small thing, yet it felt monumental, as if it were the missing piece of something much larger, something he hadn't yet fully understood. With a steady hand, he rose and placed the key in his coat pocket, resolving to think about it later. Now wasn't the time to make assumptions. He had to return to the man, the one who had been so intent on staying hidden. Maigret left the apartment as quietly as he had entered, the chestnut tree outside still casting long shadows across the wet pavement. The rain had begun again, a steady drizzle that made the streets slick and glistening. He didn't need to rush. There was time, always time, in these sorts of cases. He moved deliberately, his thoughts distant but focused on the key. What did it unlock? And more importantly, who had hidden it here, waiting for someone like him to find it? A few hours later, Maigret found himself at the café he often frequented, the small one near the Pont Neuf, where he could sit in the corner and watch the world go by. He wasn't looking for answers in the faces around him, not yet. He needed to process what he had found, to allow the puzzle to breathe before he dove back into it. The cafe was almost empty at this hour. A few locals nursing their drinks. An old man hunched over his newspaper. Maigret ordered a coffee, strong and black, and sat at his usual table. He took the key from his coat pocket and turned it over in his fingers. There was no engraving, no clue to what it might unlock, but Maigret was certain it wasn't random. This was no trinket. This was a key to something important. The question, as always, was to what? He leaned back in his chair, watching the slow, steady flow of rain against the window. The rhythm was soothing, a constant reminder that things took time. That's what he had learned over the years. Time, patience, and silence were the tools of a detective. The answers weren't hidden in the noise, in the shouting or the hurry, but in the quiet moments, in the pauses between actions. The door to the cafe opened, and a figure stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat. Maigret barely glanced up, but the man's presence was undeniable. It was the broad-shouldered man from the apartment. Without acknowledging Maigret, the man moved to the counter and ordered a drink. Maigret took a long, slow sip from his coffee, watching him with half-closed eyes. He didn't need to make a scene. This wasn't about confrontation. The man didn't know Maigret was following him. He wouldn't yet, but soon, Maigret thought, soon. The time would come. The man sat alone at a table near the back, his posture rigid, as if he were waiting for something or someone. Maigret continued to observe him, noting the small details, the way the man tapped his fingers on the table, the slight furrow of his brow, the way his eyes kept flicking toward the door. He was nervous. Maigret could see that clearly now. Nervous, but trying to hide it behind an exterior of calm control. Maigret finished his coffee, setting the cup down quietly. He didn't want to make a show of his movements. He stood, casually, as if he had no particular intention. He approached the man's table, his footsteps soft on the old floorboards. When he reached the table, the broad-shouldered man looked up, his face betraying no surprise. He had expected this moment. "Chief Inspector Maigret," the man said, his voice deep and neutral, a slight edge of wariness creeping in. "I thought I might find you here." Maigret said nothing at first, taking a seat across from the man. He studied him carefully, watching the way he fidgeted with his cup, his fingers moving in the same nervous pattern they had at the apartment. There was tension in the man's every movement, but also a certain determination. It was the way a person behaved when they had decided they would not yield, no matter what. "I imagine you're wondering about the chestnut tree," Maigret said quietly, his gaze steady. The man's eyes flickered, but he kept his composure. "It's just an old tree," he replied, a little too quickly. "I don't see what it has to do with anything." Maigret smiled slightly, his lips curling in a way that was not entirely kind. "Perhaps. But then again, you've been very careful about your movements. You don't like to leave things to chance, do you?" The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Maigret's silence stretched on, making the air between them heavy. There was something to be said, but neither of them was ready to speak. And yet, the truth lay somewhere beneath their words, and it was only a matter of time before it came to the surface. Maigret leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly, It's not just the chestnut tree that's important. You see, it's what's been buried under it. The rain continued to fall in steady drips, soaking the streets and muffling the world outside the cafe. The dim light inside cast long shadows over the man's face, and Margaret's eyes never left him. The silence stretched, each second a quiet weight pressing down on both of them. The broad-shouldered man didn't react at first, but his fingers, still playing with his cup, stopped their movement for just a moment. It was the smallest of gestures, but Margaret had learned long ago that in moments of silence, the smallest details were the loudest. "You seem to be troubled by something, my friend," Margaret said, his voice calm, almost paternal. "Your nerves are showing. You think I'm here to accuse you, don't you?" The man's mouth opened slightly, as though he was about to speak, but then he stopped himself. His eyes darted to the door, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. But the cafe was empty. It was just the two of them, alone in the room with the rain and the silence. Margaret's gaze softened. "I'm not here to accuse you," he said, "at least not yet. What I want is to understand. I want to understand what's been buried under that tree, and, more importantly, why it matters so much to you." The man finally looked up at Margaret, his eyes weary. "What do you know about it? What could you possibly understand?" Margaret leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "I know that people go to great lengths to hide their secrets, and I know that the past has a way of catching up with them, no matter how far they try to run." His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "The chestnut tree isn't just an old tree, is it? It's a marker, a place where something was hidden, something important." The man's jaw clenched, his eyes flicking around the cafe again. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, his voice low, almost inaudible. Margaret continued to study him. He could see the tightness in the man's posture, the way his hands balled into fists when he spoke, the way his gaze kept darting nervously. The man was trying to control his emotions, but it was clear he was losing the battle. "The key, for example," Margaret said, his tone still even, "isn't meant for a lock, is it? It's meant for something else, something you didn't want anyone to find. And you knew, when you placed it in that chest, that one day someone would come looking." The man shifted in his seat, his eyes finally meeting Margaret's. For a moment, there was a flicker of recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that Margaret was right. Then, just as quickly, it disappeared, replaced by a mask of defiance. "You're wrong," the man said, his voice steady, but Margaret could hear the faint tremor beneath the words. "There's nothing there, nothing that matters." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, allowing the words to hang in the air. He wasn't trying to force a confession. That wasn't how he worked. He wasn't interested in grand speeches or dramatic confessions. What mattered was the truth, and sometimes the truth came slowly, quietly, like the drip of rain against a window. "I don't believe you," Margaret said finally. "Not because I think you're lying, but because I can see it in your eyes. There's something you're not telling me, something that's eating away at you." The man didn't answer, but Margaret could see the conflict in him, the desire to say something, and yet the fear of speaking the truth. It was the kind of fear Margaret had seen in many people before, people who had done something they regretted, something they couldn't take back, and now they were trying to bury it. Margaret sat there for a moment longer, watching the man. He didn't hurry him, didn't press. Sometimes all it took was time, space, and silence. Eventually, the man broke. "I didn't want it to happen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want any of it. But sometimes things get out of hand." Margaret didn't respond immediately. He simply watched, his face unreadable, his eyes sharp but compassionate. He was waiting for the man to continue, to say more. The man looked down at his hands, his fingers shaking now. "I never meant to hurt anyone. But things went wrong." She didn't understand. She thought I had. She thought I had abandoned her. I didn't. But it was too late. Margaret leaned forward, his gaze intense. Who are you talking about?" The man swallowed hard. "It was Charlotte. She was everything to me. But she didn't believe me anymore. She thought I'd forgotten about her. She thought I was going to leave her. And I never meant for her to die." The words hit Margaret like a blow. There it was, the truth, hidden beneath all the layers of fear and guilt. The man hadn't killed her out of malice or spite, but out of fear. Fear of losing her, fear of being alone, and in the end, it had led to something far worse than either of them had imagined. "Tell me what happened," Margaret said quietly, his voice calm. The man looked up, his eyes filled with shame. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. It was just supposed to be a fight, a loud argument. "I didn't mean to push her. I didn't mean for her to hit her head. It was an accident, but I didn't know what to do. So His voice faltered, and he looked away, ashamed. "You buried her," Margaret finished for him. "You thought that if you hid her, if you kept everything quiet, it would all go away." The man nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I didn't want anyone to know. I couldn't bear the thought of anyone finding out what I had done." Margaret's expression softened. It wasn't pity he felt. Margaret had seen too many men like him to feel pity. But there was understanding. He knew the weight of guilt, the crushing isolation that came from carrying a secret so heavy it could break a person. "You buried her under the chestnut tree," Margaret said, "because it was the one place no one would think to look." The man nodded again, his face crumpling with emotion. "I never thought it would come to this. I never thought anyone would ever find out." Margaret sat back in his chair, his mind turning over the final pieces of the puzzle. The mystery was solved, but the truth wasn't a dramatic revelation. It wasn't a grand confession. It was simple, tragic, and human. A woman lost, a man broken, and a secret that had taken far too long to surface. The cafe was silent once again, the rain still falling outside. Margaret stood slowly, his eyes on the man, who was now staring at the table in front of him, lost in his own thoughts. "Go home," Margaret said quietly. "Tell the truth. Let it go." The man didn't reply, but Margaret knew he had heard. There was nothing more to say. As Margaret walked out into the rain-soaked streets of Paris, he felt the weight of the case lift from his shoulders. There were no grand triumphs, No sweeping victories, just a quiet resolution, and the knowledge that in the end the truth had come out. The chestnut tree would stand, as old and unmoving as it had always been, but now it carried a different weight. A secret, long buried, had finally been unearthed, and that was enough.